My name is Marina Moskowitz. I know some people here, but not everyone. And this is Andrew Popp, who I think many of you know as well. And we're really thrilled because when we decided to do this, we had no idea if there would be like two people in the room and us. So anyway, this is really fun. We intended something much more interactive than the setup of this room suggests. So I hope that we can subvert the design of this space to make that happen. We're really interested more in like posing some questions and having some conversation about how, as business historians, we can think about the sources we look at and the writing that we do. Then we are interested in pontificating. So I'm just going to say a few words. The session that we're at right now really started as a series of messages on Twitter. I think maybe even back in the day before Elon Musk took over. I can't quite remember the timing. I had just read the book Trust by Hernan Diaz. And I don't even remember what prompted me to say to Andrew, but something that you had tweeted or whatever. And I was like, oh, you should look at this book. I think you would really enjoy it. It has some interesting things to say about history and the way we practice it, even though, or maybe because it is a work of fiction. And that led to some messaging back and forth. And we were like, well, what if we broadened out this conversation at the Business History Conference? And I think both of us are really interested in writing and the craft of writing as part of what we do. And I think over the past few years here, there have been some really interesting conversations about the types of source materials that people are looking at in business history and maybe how those have been changing, maybe how historians have gotten innovative about creating their archive. I don't know if people have read the book. If not, we hope this will encourage you to. But one of the things, and by all means, don't feel like you have to have read it to take part in the conversation. That was our jumping off point, but we're very happy to have a broader conversation. But I think one of the inspirations, at least for me, was to think about what some of the kind of quote unquote standard sources in the long history or historiography of business history have been. Things like the memoirs of the titans of industry or things like that. And how to balance those singular visions with other sources, right? Like things that we know might be a particular take and maybe something that is actually very constructed. And how do we think about those constructions in relation to the construction of source material that we put together, and then the construction of the narrative that we write or put in an exhibition or a podcast or however we choose to share that work. I had a project a long while ago where I was writing about material culture and notions of the standard of living. And when I did that work, I looked at sort of a lot of different takes on what people owned in the turn of the 20th century and sort of the economic life of the country. So I looked at sociological studies, I looked at business papers, I looked at statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I looked at fiction. And one of the reasons I looked at fiction is that when you're interested in people's really like mundane everyday life, it's sometimes hard to find first-person accounts of that. People don't write, beautiful penned letters about like the bathroom fixtures they just bought or, their flatware that they eat with every day or things that I was interested in writing about. But actually a lot of novelists of sort of what one bibliographer calls social fiction do write about that. And so it was a way to get some sense of what, people in society are, how they're engaging with business culture and consumer culture. And things got really interesting when I started to look at source material where some of those voices were commenting on one another. And I'm reminded of a quote from the American novelist Sherwood Anderson, who shortly after writing the book Winesburg, Ohio, which is a work of fiction, was reading the study Middletown by Robert and Dorothy Lind. And it's a book, a sociological study. It was sort of bringing the fieldwork methods of anthropology to an American community rather than a far-flung community. It was bringing participant observation in, very statistical, very fact-driven. And Anderson reads it and is writing to his then fiancée, later wife, and sort of says, well, I'm reading this book, but I do feel like my novel, has as much truth, and that's the word that he uses, and that he thinks, there's a place for an artist in truth telling as well as someone coming from the social sciences or other types of academic study. And that for me has been really an interesting provocation to think about, again, both what types of sources we take in and what kinds of outputs we put out. So I think for me, the big question that I'm hoping we'll sort of get at and discuss along the way is how are the narratives that we use as source material constructed, and then how do we construct narratives to them? But there are many steps along the way to answer that big question. So I will pass over to you.
And when Marina said that we were perhaps planning something more interactive, you can probably read that as we're not very ready. And I genuinely didn't expect an audience like this or a room like this, and you're going to be distracted by this view over here. I'm going to start by saying that I really, really dislike historical fiction. And I hold this prejudice despite the fact that I don't read it, right? I don't read historical fiction whatsoever. But I did just read Rose Tremaine's novel, Music and Silence, which is set in the Danish court of Christian IV, a CBS colleague here in the room, which is a piece of historical fiction which mixes real historical figures with imaginative fictional characters and creates plot lines that interweave historical facts, if you like, and entirely imaginary plots. And I'm happy to say that reading this novel only confirmed me in my prejudice against historical fiction. So one reading from that is a belief that there should be a very clear separation between historical writing and fiction writing. And I want to state categorically straight away that that's not what I believe. So one question is why do I dislike historical fiction so much if I believe that there is a profitable, valuable relationship between historical writing and fiction writing? So that's one that's one question that comes out of that. If it doesn't look like historical fiction, then what should the relationship between history writing and fiction writing look like? And I think the other thing I bring to this conversation is a personal sense of frustration sometimes, because I have been trying in recent years to push my own writing, in some pieces at least, in new directions, and it's generally not very welcome. And sometimes it's extremely unwelcome. I find myself butting up sometimes, increasingly so, against the limits of how we are supposed to write as historians. And I'm interested in exploring, again, where the boundaries are and how they can be bridged and crossed. And here I have to confess I'm a complete hypocrite, because I also edit a journal, and at which I strictly maintain the forms of historical writing that are expected of the discipline. I mean, I wouldn't publish my own stuff, let me put it that way. So yes, as Marina mentioned, the idea for this conversation really came out of our readings of Hernan Diaz's novel Trust. Has anyone in the room read it? Fantastic. So we can stop now, and you can all just have a conversation about who liked it. Good. I'm very glad to see the financial historian in the room liked it. And did anyone dislike it? But we have a few prompts that we're going to try and work from. And although this doesn't focus on Diaz's novel, I'm going to use him as a starting point, because he gives great interviews in which he explicitly reflects on the relationship between his work and historical writing, the work of historians, and indeed archives. So he is great for that. And so I'm going to start with a prompt comes or builds on something that he said in an interview from 2022. But I'm going to start with an essay, a recent essay by the business historian Michael Heller, who some of us know, who declared that history was by nature a discipline of suspicion. And then in a paper that I'm currently trying to get through the review process, in the section on sources, I asked the reader, do you trust me? And obviously Diaz's book is called Trust. And in this 2020 interview, Diaz argued that, I quote, reading is always an act of trust. Whenever we read anything from a novel to the label on the prescription bottle, trust is involved. That trust is based on tacit contracts, whose clauses I wanted to encourage the reader to reconsider. Genre is a great example of trust in literature. We feel a great sense of betrayal when conventions are violated for no good reason. So some questions kind of emerge from this. What are the tacit contracts that are involved in writing historical narratives? What are the conventions? When do we feel betrayed? And maybe when do we need to let go of that sense of betrayal? So what's written into the genre of historical writing is essentially the question here.
So my name's Keith Hollingsworth. I'm from Atlanta. But I was thinking that when I read books that are fiction, I don't want to say historical fiction. They're actually more trashy novels but they're based in a certain place or time. I like it when the author puts an afterword that says, this is what's true, this is what's not true. So to me, that's a sort of part of that genre, is that they can say this explosion did happen, but this part I made up. So you can't go through the whole book that way, but certainly the big historical events that happen, to me, of genre part of it is explaining at the end, this did occur, this didn't occur, here's some things I took license with.
Sharon Murphy, Providence College. So, like, to Keith's point, I think that what I liked about Trust when I read it because the two of you told me I needed to read it, but I do like historical fiction in general. But one of the things I liked about the book was the way in which it almost took you through the process of doing what you actually are talking about, where you're actually seeing through the novel how, my trust in that first story, it just got uprooted by seeing the other side, someone else's viewpoint, and then seeing, well, how was that constructed into your point of even biography and autobiography. And I think, in my work, I was enmeshed in corporate biographies, which are just horrendous genre, like just the self-congratulatory smut, it's like worse than bad fiction. I actually said to my advisor at one point, shoot me if I ever get asked to do one of these. But I think that was one of the things about the book, that you're actually living through that process of having your trust tested in there. So
I think we, when we put in footnotes, we're implying this invitation to check up on us. And so there's this piece of action that we're suggesting on the part of the reader that is not required when you're writing fiction. They can just stay in their chair, but we're always saying, you can look at it, you can see if I'm right. Oh, and Megan Elias, Boston University.
I mean, and that suggests that we're less comfortable with making things tacit, right? Yeah. And that the norms can't go unspoken, that we have to constantly verbalize those or manifest those conventions. We have to write them down and repeat them. And
I would even say that kind of rigor is a lot of how we define our professional writing. I mean, and that's how we separate it from other people. And even, I would say, in this day and age, like that use of footnotes or endnotes as opposed to like parenthetical documentation, which is often a much looser form of documentation, right? Like, I'm referring to this book. Like, those of us who still.
So I'm Pam Laird, in Denver currently, and one of the points that struck me having to do with this particular discussion is how in the third piece, Ida, who the journalist, novelist, writer, professional writer, commented on her going through at just an amazing speed all kinds of sources and not making citations and not making references to them, not taking notes, and that the result was that everything just sort of blended in her head, which for her purposes was useful, but for our purposes as professional historians and for our readers is a disaster. And it's a little hard. So, for example, one of the things that I'm working on right now goes back to thoughts that I was thinking back in my college days and back in the 80s and 90s and so on. And those thoughts are all kind of mushed up in my head. But when I say something in the text, I try to say, this thought came from such and such. I mean, I don't put all those words in because my editor would have a fit at adding all those words, but I'll put in a citation to something, at least of the category that I was reading 50 years ago that led me to this. I try. But, a lot of it's just mushed up, and it might have been from somebody I talked to when I was 18, for all I know. Who knows?
So does that suggest that sometimes our tacit contract and our conventions are actually a cover for a different kind of process that's going on that we can't always reduce to a citation? And what is happening in those moments, I would say. I remember years and years ago, my dear friend Francesca Carnevale saying to me afterwards, "You're just making it all up." And I was hewing really closely to my sources, which were private correspondence between a man and a wife. But yeah, there was to an extent, there was a way in which I was making it all up. So maybe sometimes these contracts and conventions are a cover that we use to hide behind, perhaps.
Hi, I'm Eric Abrahamson from Rapid City, South Dakota. I wanted to push back a little bit on what you said, Sharon, because I do a lot of contracted history for people in lots of different contexts. And I've been doing it for 30 years. And one of the things it's taught me is that all history is constructed. And history often belongs to the people who are telling the story. And I think that we sort of are not privileged enough to be able to steal those stories from those people and to pretend that we are the arbiters of truth. And I think one of the things I really liked about this book is that it has contested versions of truth. And even when you get to the end, I wasn't convinced that I could, even trust that last section. You felt like the author was tipping the scale rather than the characters. And I felt like, again, what was great about it was that you were in a contested search for the truth, and that was the real strength of it.
Hi, Ativa Pertillo from Washington, German Historical Institute. I think that one of the things that occurs to me is the effect of the kind of scale of the narrative that you're reading and sort of how long you're kind of willing to trust what the writer is trying to tell you. And I'm thinking in particular of Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which is kind of an amazing book, but she kind of says at the beginning, there's a lot that I'm just kind of conjecturing. And the way the book is structured, it's kind of like a series of vignettes about African-American women's lives from like the 1880s to the 1930s or so. And I think, if it had been the kind of thing where it was, taking one sort of specific life, either real or imagined, and trying to take you on like a kind of composite journey, you wouldn't necessarily be able to kind of suspend that, suspend your willingness to rely on being told that, this story is fully accurate or hews really closely to the sources. But I think in the sense that it's kind of like, taking, a chapter here and a chapter there and kind of saying, this is how far I can stretch this particular set of sources to tell you something that is not literally written on the page. You kind of are willing to kind of suspend your disbelief or something long enough to get a lot out of it.
Are we as historians more willing or even maybe more expected to do that in places where maybe we don't have as strong a written record? And so we were talking before about that, the use of footnotes as the fiction, right? do we feel like we have a responsibility to include people in the historical record generally? And so maybe there are places where we want to make sure those voices are inserted. I mean, I know for me as a scholar really of material culture and business, we'll often look to objects to look for things that are signs of histories that we maybe don't find in the written record. But I don't know. I just raised that question about sort of, who gets included. I mean, I think this idea that like people own their own histories is a really important one. And so what do we as historians do? Like, are we channeling? What do we do if we get contradictory records? What if we do if we don't have a record at all? And I think that idea about sort of critical fabulation is so important there.
Al Chirella, Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, and one of my favorite activities when teaching in the classroom is to give students an article on some aspect of history. They read it, and by and large, they're convinced this is the truth. And then I give them an article that adopts a radically different interpretation of basically the same events, and they become more confused. And so, which is the truth? Which is what really happened? I mean, they're both true. I mean, they're not fabricated narratives. They're both real stories. But, anytime we infer, anytime we interpret, anytime we posit a cause and effect relationship, we are, in a sense, writing a fictional narrative. We only hope that we got it right. But I guess if we want to be absolutely scrupulously true to the standards of history, we wouldn't write narratives at all. We'd simply list names and dates. I mean, facts that are proven to be true without connecting or and figuring out how they connect one with the other.
So again, Keith Hollingsworth from Atlanta, Georgia. Let me just actually give an example of one that's probably bad to think about this. It's a very popular book, came out about 30 years ago, called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, set in Savannah. I actually grew up about an hour from there. I remember that case. One of the main characters in the book came from my hometown. But that's a book that didn't really advertise itself as historical fiction, but it is fiction. I mean, it was based on real events, but there's a lot of fiction in there, but it didn't read that way. It read like a newspaper. I don't know if y'all have read the book, but it reads like a newspaperman's reporting. But I think that's an example where I would almost say bad, because it didn't advertise itself as fiction. And he didn't call it that. He called it sort of like extended newspaper. I forgot what he called it, but he didn't call it fiction per se, but there is a lot of fiction in that book. I mean, the characters were real, but a lot of the interactions were fiction.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting in terms of that idea of the contract, right? That it's breaking the contract. I know you wanted to respond.
And I haven't read that book, but would In Cold Blood be a good comparison?
Oh, yes, that's another one that was...
Or The Executioner's Song, maybe. So I wanted to pick up on things that several of you said about the construction of history, and Al was talking about truth and kind of scrupulous adherence to facts, which are obviously really important. They're core to what we do and to our professional identity. But one reason I wanted to have this conversation about the relationship between history and fiction, or we might say truth and untruth, and fact and unfact, is that I see history carrying huge political weight nowadays. I'm British. I don't live there anymore, but I follow the political debates that are going on, and history has never been more politicized in my lifetime that I can remember than it is currently. And in Britain, that's primarily at the moment in relationship to empire. And to the transatlantic slave trade. And obviously these debates are also really, really current in American politics currently and elsewhere in the world. So history carries huge political weight, I think, at the moment. And very often I find that we're cast in that debate in ways that misunderstand us enormously. And as soon as we offer a new interpretation, we're accused of being revisionists. as if there is a single truth. And I try and explain to people there is no single historical truth. There's history that's true or untrue. It's factually correct or factually incorrect, but there is no single true history. And but that's consistently misunderstood, I think, by the public who don't, for good reason, because they're not historians, don't understand that all history is constructed and revisionist. So I don't know if it's our conventions and our scrupulousness that traps us into that misunderstood position within these intensely political debates. That's just a thought, and part of why I feel like being a historian is more important than ever, but also more difficult than ever.
Hi, Alan Loeb. I taught a course in environmental history at Johns Hopkins in Washington, and the thing that reflects really on what Andrew had to say is that it was really important for the students. It was a seminar. There were 9 of them. They're all working in political capacities in one form or another, trade associations, law firms, whatever it was. But it was amazing to see. I couldn't teach them any truths about things, but when they got into the issues, they were swimming in a sea of assertions about the political implications and people using history to make points. But at least in teaching the class, I was able to give them a background, because absent what I gave them, they really had very, very little to use in determining for their own purposes whether any of the stuff they were hearing was true. And so even if you can't teach them the truth, or maybe should not try to teach them the truth, you have to think about the vacuum that most students are dealing with in this political atmosphere.
Yeah, and I know there was a question at the back, but just to that, I would say, for me, these questions are so live because I think we're struggling to find a position from which we can assert the value of the work that we do as historians. We're not winning this battle at the moment, if I can put it that way.
And I believe I have my facts correct on this. There's a bill pending in the Indiana state legislature that requires, and I don't know what the details are, that history books that are assigned and I believe also published by university faculty must adopt a completely balanced and even-handed narrative, which to a non-practitioner of history sounds quite plausible, but it eliminates a lot of the ability that we have to interpret, to whether you want to call it revisionism or not, to imagine new ideas and everything. And yeah, I was some years ago invited to be a talking head or something on a History Channel program, The Men Who Built America, and the title, of course, is hugely problematic right there. And apparently, I wasn't actually in contact with my fellow presenters. Apparently, among others, they included Alan Greenspan and Donald Trump, which puts me in some kind of company. But it was clear to me that they were pushing me to say things to fit their preconceived narrative. And I said, well, off camera, right? It didn't really happen like that. It's not accurate. Well, yeah, but can't you? It's like, but nah. And it was very clear that if I didn't say the kinds of things that they wanted me to say, it wasn't going to get on the air. They were not looking for any kind of objective reality. They were looking for a very clear, preconceived, evidence to support their narrative. Yeah.
And that's where our tacit contracts with ourselves kick in, right? When we're asked to do that.
This is Pam again. And one of the things about the book, Trust, that is relevant to this discussion is the whole idea of revision upon discovery of new evidence. And, if a chemist did not revise the whatever the chemist inherited as a graduate student, that person wouldn't keep his or her job. every other profession is expected to do revision. But I think the point that everybody's been making about the importance of history is how desperately people cling to the idea that what they learned or they valued is the truth. And any revision is like going back and saying, no, your mother really wasn't a saint, or whatever. In other words, it's really hitting a core, but we have to keep insisting, no, we have new evidence, we have new perspectives, or we are valuing evidence that was ignored before. I mean, the Midwife's Tale, Laura Thatcher Ulrich, is a classic example of taking material that had been ignored for, I don't know, 2 centuries almost, and coming up with an incredibly valuable narrative. So revision is what we do. We just have to somehow get somebody to keep paying for it.
And to pick up on that and think about practical kind of writing tactics and strategies, and this isn't something I've ever done, but has anyone tried rewriting any of their own work years or decades later? I'm genuinely, I'm just interested. Has anyone tried doing that? Has anyone? Yeah. Can you speak to them?
Naomi Oreskes from Carlisle, Massachusetts. Yeah, there's a great conversation. I have like 100,000 thoughts, but I'll just respond to that. So my first book was, I'm a historian of science by training who's moved into things that overlap with what people here do. My first book was about the debate over continental drift theory, mostly focused on the United States. And one of the reasons I looked at that debate was because that was a case where scientists had looked at a theory, the idea that continents moved, said, no, that's not right. 40 years later, looked at it again and said, oh, actually it is right. So it fits, so I really resonate with what you said. I mean, I would say as a historian and philosopher of science, the core of scientific work is the capacity to rethink ideas in light of new evidence. And that's absolutely essential. So I think it's Diane. Sorry, Pam. Pam's point is really important. As historians, we don't do as good a job. I mean, scientists don't do a really good job of explaining this either, because they get into trouble on the same issue. But we don't do a good job of explaining the relationship between our conclusions and our evidentiary base. And that when we discover new evidence, which we often do, or, as you said, rethink old evidence in light of new perspectives, that of course our views will change. And that's a good thing. In the old days, people would say that was progress. Now the word progress is contested nowadays as well. But, I think we could re-embrace that notion of conceptual or epistemic progress and say, yeah, of course we re-examine. And then I wanted to just, in a friendly way, push back about what you said about people not appreciating the importance of history. First of all, I think history has always been political. I think all you have to do is think of the term Whig history to realize how old this issue is. I mean, what we do is incredibly consequential because it is all about what Pam just said, about how we think about who we are, and how we came to be where we are, and whether our heroes were or were not the people that we thought they were. And I think that actually people do get this, and that's why history gets so contested. And if you look at the disciplines that have been attacked in recent years by right-wing sources, I don't know how many people here know about the National Association of Scholars, but this is this right-wing pseudo-academic organization that uses the abbreviation NAS to pretend they're the National Academy of Sciences, but they're not. They're a kind of weird epistemic astroturf organization. But they attack academics, and the group they hate the most, the academic field they hate the most, is critical gender or women's studies, but the group they hate second is us, historians. And they have attacked historians across this country. And actually, one thing I wish our profession would do is to be more proactive and engaged in defending ourselves and each other by being more aware of this and being able to say, yes, of course we change our views because we have new information.
Hi, my name is Gabriela Recio. I come from Mexico. And I wanted to share with you, I'm a professional historian, but the project I'm doing right now is trying to write creative nonfiction. So I'm trying to do the other way around. It has been very difficult because I'm trying to do it. I have my historian mind on my head. And at the beginning, I had to prove every single thing I said, like where this image came from. If I'm talking about something very specific about the weather or whatever, if I really had to check if the weather was like that at that moment, etc. So that's like the historian on my mind talking. And what I decided to do is surround myself in these workshops with novelists, fiction writers, and whatever, to see how they approach their writing, how they write, how they see how they transmit ideas, you know, which is they are very different from how we structure and how we think. And for me, it has been very interesting when they read my writing, because for them it's like really hard to read for them. So I have been learning a lot of that from them, which is if you have not done that, it's probably, if you're thinking of doing that, it's probably interesting to do that. And another book that might help you in this, if it's fiction or or not fiction, it's a book by Benjamin Labatut. I think in English it was translated as "When We Cease to Understand This World," and it's about physicists and mathematicians at the early 20th century. And the first part of the book is, he says, well, at the end of the book, he says, the first essay is mostly truth, but as the book progresses, it's more fiction. So it's very interesting to read how he portrays these physicists and mathematicians. And it really makes you think the way Trust made me think, in terms of how historical things are explained, or how things that happen in the past are explained, and how maybe we read them and understand them and interpret them.
Yeah, and that just, I saw those hands, and I mean, that just makes me think of also perhaps some of this is coming from the other direction too, because there is, of course, the whole field of autofiction and the relationship between the real lives of authors writing novelized, often autobiographies, autofiction, and so the kind of blending and blurring is happening from that direction as well. Yeah, but there were a couple of hands at the back here, please.
Yeah, I'm Heather Welland from SUNY Binghamton, and I've just been thinking about, writing conventions and the question of rigor. Like, we really love an unreliable narrator in fiction, I think, right? We find that really delightful and surprising. But then in our own writing, we're very obsessed with being reliable narrators. And I guess I would recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, Barbara Hannawalt's book on growing up in medieval London, in which it's a major scholarly work, and she makes a big historiographical intervention, and it's based on court records. I mean, she really sort of establishes her chops as a quote unquote reliable narrator, but she prefaces each chapter with these fictionalized vignettes that are allowed to sort of have the reader enter into the intimate space of a household in medieval London. And I always loved that as a kind of a genre bending exercise that managed to sort of combine techniques of fiction with the kind of scholarly evidence techniques that we're used to. Like, she's a fiction writer, but she's also wedded to Chicago, which I really like. And I have tried to do that sometimes in my own work, not that I've ever shared this with anybody. And it's really hard to do. I mean, I guess just to touch on your point, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Gabrielle. It's actually really difficult to do. I guess it's harder to be a creative writer than we might think. Like, I guess we all in this room write a lot, but we write in a certain way. And I don't know if it's because of habit and training or because of disposition, but...
Hi, I'm Aparajit Ramnath from Ahmedabad University, India. And thank you. So many thoughts welling up, but I'll pick one or two. I really I agree with what Keith said at the beginning about there being a sort of contract. For me, when I'm reading something, I really enjoy certain kinds of historical fiction, and people who take, like you said, take writing and the craft of recreating an atmosphere seriously. But I want to know, like you said, I want to have the opportunity to make my own judgment as well, even if that's after I've come out of the fictional world and then want to reflect on what's happened. On the flight over, I was watching Oppenheimer yesterday, and I thought it did a good job in the sense that it clearly takes liberties, but then it also is, unlike a lot of biopics, it leaves certain things open, right? It gives you different interpretations and doesn't really take a side on certain things, which you could see as a cop-out, but you could also see as an invitation to the viewer to think more deeply about certain things. And I think that that transparency about what the author is trying to do is, for me, very important. And if that's in place, then we can do all kinds of different things. There's something in between the two, between fiction and academic history, which is, like Gabriela said, I've just finished a manuscript which is a biography. And of course, popular types of history require different kinds of, we need to learn, like you said, it turns out to be much harder to produce certain kinds of writing. And then you also have this training in your head which says you really exactly, you have to say what the weather was like. You have to know, you can't describe the color of a building unless you really know. And sometimes we assume certain things were the same as they are today, but they weren't. And how do you make that? How do you give the reader a chance to check up on those things without really destroying the whole process of creating a narrative? I think that's been an interesting question. One specific thought that I have on that is sometimes we say things about a character or a historical character which doesn't draw, like Pam said, on a particular source, but it draws on your understanding of engaging with primary sources over a long period of time. So how do you cite that? Right? If I say this person was not a pacifist, how do I cite that? And I think that becomes interesting in more personality-driven accounts. And I was just wondering if people had any thoughts on.
I think just my answer to that is it depends who's reading you, right? Like if I'm reading you as a historian, I'm going to say, how does he know that? But your average reader isn't going to ask that question, and it's going to believe you if you're doing it well. So I think that's, this is the audience question. Who are we writing for? Right. What if Andrew reads our book?
Yeah. I mean, the reader has to make a connection in his mind that he's a pacifist. If you say this guy is a pacifist, then it's like, oh, come on, and you shut the book down and you throw it away. But if you kind of describe him, or there are a lot of ways of doing it without saying he's a pacifist. And images are more potent in the reader than if you say, oh, come on, this is a pacifist, and then turn the page. Images are very, very powerful. And if you are able to manage someone to read for 10 minutes instead of looking into the phone, then you made it. You're good explaining and narrating.
So audiences are clearly really important, but something that struck me, and I'm not exactly sure where in there, it's our narratives are fragile, and we easily kind of break the flow that might engage the reader by suddenly weighting it down with the evidence. And so there's a balance there that's really tricky.
Maybe that's also one of the reasons for our love of footnotes, right? Is that we can take some of those bits that might break our narrative or stretch it or whatever, and put them somewhere else, right? Like park them somewhere else, which again it calls into question some of our practices. Anyway, over there, I think you were.
Yeah, I'm Louise. I'm a colleague of Andrew, and I read Trust because he recommended it one day over lunch. Yeah, I think actually I would like to get back to this about how do I say he's a pacifist or something else, because I think your answer is a little bit maybe too easy, because I think it's a real struggle sometimes that you really want to say something and you have been reading thousands and thousands of pages, and especially when you write about, right now I'm writing about something happening around year 2000, I'm drowning in sources and I can never go through all the sources. So how do I actually quote things in a good way, tell people that, okay, I know that these were not the motives they were given. And I actually liked Trust because it kind of helped me. So what I'm doing right now is that I'm actually providing two narratives. One, it's about a local bank who wanted to do something really good for the local community, but it all ended with bankruptcy in the financial crisis, and it all went really bad. And they ended in court for more than 10 years. So the general narrative in Denmark is one about villains, but it is also one about heroes. So it is a story about heroes, or is it a story about villains? And right now I'm writing two different narratives and providing both stories. One story that ends in the beginning of September 2008, and then I start again, and then I ended when the last court case ended in 2022. So again, I think it helped me, and that's why I like the book. Yeah.
Well, I want to read that, but I will get a chance to read it,
You will.
I'm sure, soon in one of our seminars. And I've done that once before. I told the same story twice in the same paper. So,
I'm doing that in my paper on Saturday.
so and I know there was, I think, but if people have examples of other writing strategies that perhaps don't stick as closely as possible to the conventions and the contracts, then it would be great to hear about them. And I think writing a double narrative is a really interesting exercise.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Taylor from the University of Pittsburgh. I haven't read the book, although this makes me excited to read. And so I wanted to ask those of you who had, whether any of you had thoughts or could imagine trust becoming a historical source. Whether, it says something about its moment that at some time in the future might have validity as a source in its own right. I'm an art historian, and so I feel quite comfortable writing about, taking creative objects as historical evidence and mixing those creative sources with other kind of quote unquote more factual ones. And so I wondered whether the question with which I began also points to a broader one less around footnotes maybe and more about style, that the fact that I've never attempted, although occasionally have contemplated, adopting a more creative style in my own writing is actually an anxiety about making sure I keep the objects I study separate from me and making sure that it doesn't look like I'm trying to do what artists or filmmakers or designers do in my own prose.
Well, if I could jump in on the question of would you use trust as a historical source, I totally would, but I think these things are so context dependent. So my most recent book is about the construction of myths about capitalism. So that book for me would be perfect because it's about the construction of myths, right? And I think, there's many ways to interpret that book, but I think it's pretty clear that Diaz doesn't think we should take the second story as true, right? So I would use it in that way. But I wanted to get back to this question of saying that somebody was, I think you said he was not a pacifist, right? Yeah, which I think is important. So I'm going to hold on to your not there. This is something, as I said, I came into history from a different discipline. I think that one thing we as historians should do is we should be kinder to each other. Because although I'm totally in with footnotes, and all my books have gazillions of them, what you said about you've read all this material, you feel like you have come to understand this person, and you feel that you can say with confidence, this person was not a pacifist. But yet you can't point to the specific note. To me, that's what history is all about, right? When you live with documents, you come to have insights and understandings that a person who just, helicoptered in and pulled these things at random wouldn't. And I think we've seen that sometimes in recent years when journalists especially do that. And they say, oh, look, I found this document that says X. And you're like, well, yeah, okay, but, right? Because the words might have been used in different ways. So I feel that, and this relates to the question of why more people don't read our work, even though people are extremely interested in history. Because if you think about it, what other academic discipline has a television channel, right? There's no chemistry channel, right? No mathematics channel. So, and people, if you go to the airport, it's filled with history books, but often they're books that we would consider crap, right? So why is that? And what are we doing wrong that we can't reach those audiences? And as a person who's written some more popular things, I think a lot of it has to do with exactly what you just said. And so we don't give ourselves license to say the things that we believe to be true if we can't find that specific document that proves it. And it's almost like a kind of legalistic court of law sort of standard. And I think that's a big part of what hangs us up. So I think that we should all, if you get to that point where you feel, I am sure this guy was not a pacifist. I was about to say positivist, which is something I've written about. You should say that, and maybe that goes in your afterword, or maybe you have a footnote that says, I can't find the exact document that proves it, but I'm pretty sure. And then that we as reviewers would say, yeah, go for it. I get it. That makes sense, even if you can't tell me the box and folder number. where he, on the day that he became not a pacifist.
Oh, I guess, sorry, three things quickly. First, I would much rather rely on a narrative that is conditioned by a person's broad and decades-long understanding of an individual than on someone who cherry picks a single source to, prove that they did this or they did that. As far as the historical value, I guess, of trust or anything else, I mean, I have kind of a side interest in detective fiction from the 1880s to the present, and these stories they don't tell us a lot about how crime actually occurs, but they tell us an awful lot about society and social norms. You mentioned the pit or the jungle or something like that. Again, but it tells us a lot about sort of progressive era attitudes. And so if you do a meta-analysis, not a book, but multiple books, you kind of see that. And then as the question of, technique, personally, one of the things I do is when I begin each chapter with a vignette. And as far as I know, nothing in that vignette is fictitious. But my interpretation is far more elastic in that vignette than it is in the rest of the chapter. And I don't know really why I do it that way. Maybe I'm trying to draw the reader's attention and then get them to read the rest of the story. I don't know, but it's my way of sort of giving my kind of intuitive rather than strictly intellectual sense of what's going on.
I know there are various people. It's interesting that we separate intuition and maybe that's part of the whole problem that we struggle with all of the time is that what we see as a divide within ourselves between the intuitive and creative.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on this idea that we should be kinder to each other. I mean, 100%, right? And I think the structure of the profession is such that we are obsessed with differentiation, like differentiating ourselves, and we stake out these ever narrower slices of history. And that seems different than what fiction writers are doing when they're really comfortable with these big human themes, right? Like they don't say, I can't write another novel about love. Because they think like, it's fine. Of course we can write another novel about love. I don't know. I feel like our tendency to the narrow and the specialized and the differentiated and the unkind is like pushes us away from what could be a better creative impulse to maybe recycle some of these big human themes as well.
Thank you for that. I'm right now trying to finish up a 400-year narrative, and I keep stumbling and stopping and just lying awake in the middle of the night thinking, oh my gosh, some historian somewhere who specializes in this period and this particular subject in this particular place is going to crucify me in reviews. But I can't know it all. I'm just, using a gazillion secondary sources. I'm using primary sources when I can. And these nightmares are just, like I say, keeping me up at night and keeping me from eating during the day.
As I said, my background is in history and philosophy of science, but my most recent book is about the construction, about myths about capitalism. So that was a pretty big leap, although there was obviously a transition in between. I was petrified that exactly what you said was going to happen. So I did two things. I took individual chapters and sent them to specialists in that particular thing. I asked almost no one read the whole manuscript other than my co-author, my editor, and like one or two really dedicated colleagues. But every chapter got read by a bunch of people. And so there's one chapter that deals with religion. I sent it to a historian of religion and also to a minister that I know. Another chapter on the Chicago School of Economics, sent it to 3 different people I knew who had worked on that. And so by doing that, I was able to deal with those waking up in the middle of the night moments by knowing that even though that there wasn't actually one person who could actually review the whole narrative, but I didn't need that. I just needed to make sure I covered my bases in particular things. And then the second thing that happened is I think because of the character of the book and the political moment we're in, I think my colleagues are being kind to me. And they're saying, oh, this is a really important book, and I read the trust book partly because I said, like, oh my God, there's this big novel that just came out that's kind of about very related issues. So I think because of the political moment, a lot of colleagues are being kind and not actually nitpicking about details that I'm sure are wrong, because I think they're kind of getting that the bigger argument matters. So I've been lucky in that respect. I can't promise you'll be lucky too, but I can definitely say that the first strategy worked really well. And when you ask colleagues to just read a single chapter, they almost always do, because as busy as we all are, you know, most of us can find the time to read a chapter. Whereas if you ask them to read a 400-page manuscript, that'd be asking too much in most cases.
I have a lot of ideas, and I don't know if this is going to come out right, but the conversation's been very interesting. And I think part of it's that I'm an early career scholar. I've been thrown on the timeline in this post-truth world. I myself love your book, Naomi. I ask the same questions. I wonder how capitalists like narrate themselves. And to me, it seems to be we have facts and we have interpretation. And truth, what is truth? I mean, historians are famous for saying there's multiple truths. Like, we've kind of done this to ourselves in many ways, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it all just comes down to I always wonder, like, why does this particular narrative work? Like, dominate? Like, why does it dominate at this time? And to me, they're telling fictions, like the corporate biographies you're talking about, Sharon, they're doing work, right? They're producing truths, we can say. And it goes to the audience comment too, like, why are people believing certain truths, right? What is it about their values? Like, to me, it's culture. Like, all comes down to culture, and that's the truth, right? And it's like what you believe. I don't know. The fiction versus truth is not useful for me. And I often do think that as a young historian in the archive, am I just telling the stories they want me to tell? Did the Morgans chuck the good papers like into the fireplace, and I'm just telling the story they want me to tell them? I don't know. I think about this stuff all the time. So continue the conversation.
And I think that's a really interesting line, that this fiction truth binary, it's maybe false and unhelpful. I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's facts, right? We don't want to say to people that you're entitled to your own facts. That's very important to me today. We're not entitled to your own facts. You are entitled to your own interpretation. Let me show you another one, and another one, and another one. That's right.
You know, as we think about how to be more creative, I think not just about writing, but I'd love to see us moving away to do more storyboarding, doing that type of storyboards, doing that type of multimedia. And I don't know where there's a place to really put that out now. I know one journal that sort of does that, but it's an online journal. But I actually have a student of mine doing a directed reading now to learn storyboarding and to tell a particular story about Atlanta Black businesses. But to me now, and I want to be honest, I get frustrated when people come tell faculty, you need to adjust to today's kids. And I think today's kids need to adjust to, the fact that you need to sit down and concentrate on something. And I think a lot of people have lost that art of concentration. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But I do think if we want more people to fall in love with what we do, then the notion of, in addition to the book, having a storyboard or creating those kind of websites or something is something we ought to look forward to more, and maybe have, I don't want to say journals per se, but what's a way that we can put that out and have it looked at and reviewed, that this is a good thing to do, because I think we're moving in that direction.
Just quick response to Naomi's point about multiple critics. In the author's preface to a very long delayed publication that I've been working on, I say that I give special acknowledgement to the people who are my critics, my opponents, people who have hated me in my career, worked against me for decades, opposed everything I have done, because those are the ones that make me sharpest. And I thank them for their efforts, because I have to respond to them. And that's part of the process. So I don't know if that's the answer, but that's what I'm doing, is getting people to hate me and see how it goes.
And I think when we might write alone, but we rarely are working alone, really, right? And I think this goes to something I'm sorry, I've forgotten your names, Alex, that I wanted to pick up from what you said about, you don't want to put yourself in there too much. You want to hold back. I was reading, I wish I thought I had the quote here, but I don't, in the interview with Diaz that I started that first prompt from, and I suspect now it's going to be the only prompt we get to. So novelists, they can do what they want. They're the masters of their own universe. They're making it all up. I'm caricaturing. Diaz actually says in that interview, if I see myself on the page, I feel like I've failed. So, which really surprised me. I mean, that's maybe how we're trained to think that, and we often get past it and recognize that we do need to be there on the page. But I was super surprised to see a novelist saying, I don't want to ever see myself on the page. It's not going anywhere with that thought, really. But maybe some of our feelings about our own writing are based on misconceptions about what it is that creative fiction writers are doing, perhaps. Maybe we don't understand what it is that they're doing at the same time. So that's as far as I was going with that thought. Alan.
Yeah, I guess kind of an open-ended question for you, the audience. More than one person has come up to me and said, I really loved your book, and what I loved about it the most is you don't write like a historian. And one comment I received recently is, I love your book. It reads almost like a novel. And I guess I want to ask, those comments made me very happy. Do those comments make you happy, or do they make you cringe?
Well, I and this is going to look like terrible bragging, but I just got a report back on a paper that described it as Sebuldian after W.G. Sebald, which I definitely do not deserve. But yes, of course, it made me incredibly happy for someone to say that the work read in that with that kind of quality, not tone, if you like. I think the comparison's totally misplaced. If anyone's read W.G. Sebald, if anyone hasn't, go ahead and read him. You must read him. He's wonderful. But yeah, no, I can never aspire to that. But yeah, I was delighted.
Right.
Yeah.
Or no, sorry. What does that say about the popular perception of the writing of history? Yeah, sorry, there were a few hands. Yeah.
Mark Hauser, can I just follow up with I'm curious what element, because I have a speculation as to why somebody might say this reads like a novel, but in your interpretation, what are they responding to when they say this reads like a novel to you, or to the reader, or have they articulated that?
Yeah, it's kind of an individual-driven and a character-driven narrative. I mean, one almost ironclad rule I have is there has to be at least one named individual on every single page of the book, if not, multiple. So it's not about the theoretical construction; it's about the individual person. I'd have to get back in touch with the person who made that comment and push them a little bit on that, but I think that's the reason.
From the reader's perspective, it's coming at them from a level of, an entrance through one particular figure. It's going back to one of the things that kind of began our discussion, a sort of narrative choice, a genre choice almost, where we're going to tell this through the lens of a person that's going to basically be at the level of the reader and can basically serve as a case study to walk them through the experience. That I think is, a style that I certainly try to incorporate in my own writing. I think others try to incorporate it as well. I wanted to sort of agree to, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name before, the point you were making. Yes. I'm sorry. Olga, that Olga was making about just sort of the difficulty of sort of, articulating, I think, the experience of teaching, especially kind of undergrads, especially if you're teaching kind of like a survey course where people who are engaging with being a historian or historical ideas for the first time are oftentimes extremely familiar with kind of what you might call like rudimentary postmodern thinking, and kind of are approaching your class and the idea of like what they're learning with a degree of skepticism that's basically coming from this ingrained idea largely through the culture that we live in, that is, well, there are multiple ways to interpret the past, there are multiple ways to present any issue. So whatever, this professor is presenting to me, I don't have to take it seriously because this is just, their interpretation. I can find somebody who will agree with my own personal worldview. That it is, I think, ceding the ground in some respects to other fields of scholarship, the ideas of, cultural studies and things like that are difficult to sort of, communicate as being a historian. I think being a historian and kind of building around ideas of fact, ideas of truth is something that matters and needs to sort of have a degree of pushback. You know, I get the influence of cultural studies and the benefits of having it inform some aspects of being a historian. But I think, you know, just sort of accepting other aspects of it and recognizing the broader sort of culture in which our students are conditioned to approach the study of history, it makes it very difficult to kind of do that. I'll stop talking and kind of rambling here, but I felt like Olga was kind of hitting a bigger truth that I wanted to sort of agree with in that regard.
I think as historians, we write for each other. I mean, when we're writing, we are expecting to be peer reviewed and whatever. So when we write, there is this frame in your mind that we write for each other and we read each other's books. And if you want to go to a wider audience, you have to write differently because they are not historians. And if you start presenting people like characters in a cartoon, that's how they are going to sound for them. Like, this is so and so and so and so, and then they parade like, and they understand what is driving that person or whatever. So that's what I've been trying to do differently when I write for a broader audience. Not try to think that my readers are going to be historians.
Andrew, same question for you. I'm David Floyd from University of New Brunswick. When you were complimented, or when the remark was made about being like W.G. Sebald, what did you assume that meant? What did you think that meant in terms of your capacity to write as a novelist, as a historian?
It didn't make me think I could become a novelist. I mean, so I think Austerlitz, for example, anyone who's interested in 20th century European history should read his novel, Austerlitz. That's my opinion, and other people, will disagree. So I think Sebald had an incredibly powerful contribution to understandings of 20th century European history. He, as far as I understand, there's a very murky kind of relationship between what Sebald wrote and historical truth, if you want to call it that. But it kind of goes back to the quote that you started with about Weinsberg, Ohio, being more truthful. I think there are incredibly powerful truths in a novel such as Austerlitz. Sometimes I've read it. Made me want to try and access the ability to speak to historical truths in a way that was freer than we typically allow ourselves to do within the conventions of a journal article. I think that would be my answer to that. And there was an interesting, in the same report later on, they said in brackets, by the way, the other reviewer is going to tell you that this narrative tone and structure is completely inappropriate and you must change it. And the other reviewer did exactly that. The other reviewer said this is not properly structured like an academic article, and it must have X, Y, and Z elements, a literature review, etc., etc. So this other reviewer precisely predicted what I was going to be told by reviewer 2, and it was reviewer 2. So who we all know. So, but I think you had a response.
So there's probably a whole bunch of ways, in addition to drawing really great characters or characters that are relatable, that when people say you're writing like a novelist, they mean other things as well. And can I put you on the spot and ask you, what are those other things, in addition to sort of drawing a really great character, that you think historians do when people say that's like a novel? What are those other elements that we bring into historical writing?
So if I go back to Austerlitz, and anyone in the room who's not read Sebald's Austerlitz, so I mean, this is, although there is a character at the center of that novel, they're extremely unreliable, and they're murky and unfocused and ill-defined. I think why I think it speaks so powerfully to truths about 20th century European history is his ability to draw connections and to kind of throw this incredibly far-reaching web of connections across incredibly disparate places and times, and to see the way in which they are connected at levels that historical work would often miss. So I think that is the quality in a novelist such as Sebald that I think can be incredibly powerful for historians when they're able to access it. Now, and a great example, I think, of that from historical writing is I'm gonna forget its name. Christopher Clark's not that recent book about the origins of the First World War. Now I know, what's it called? I've gone blank. The Sleepwalkers, about Europe sleepwalking into the First World War. Now I know Clark's interpretation is disputed, and he's seen as being over lenient on Germany in terms of its culpability for World War One. But it's a masterpiece of drawing unbelievably disparate connections that might appear very loose or inobvious. It's a brilliant piece of narrative history writing. And I think that's what I would see in a novel such as Austerlitz too. The ability to make connections and resonances that are not necessarily directly there in the sources.
I think there's also something that I think we're starting to have productive overlap between business history and history of emotions, and you're leading that charge. But I mean, I think for me, one of the things that's sometimes in novel-like writing that I think some of us may be a little less comfortable with it is attributing some kind of emotional valence or resonance to the past. But I think readers are often looking for that as a way to connect. And to start to bring this conversation full circle. I mean, I think we talked at the very beginning about the contract as though that was one-sided, right? As though that's something that we, here's what we are doing for our contract, but the reader is part of that contract as well, right? And so I think, Megan, you were talking about audience, and I absolutely agree with that. And to a certain extent, we think about what audience we're writing for. We write our book proposals and say, this is our audience. But I think there are things that, audiences bring, or maybe we expect an audience to bring. And so I think those ideas are really important. So I think that both the broad scale and the intimate scale are things that I feel like historians are just starting to sort of tap into and learn from.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that one of the other things that occurs to me is that speaking of contracts, is that for novelists, there's often the idea that you can kind of play around with time in a way that historians are not necessarily willing to do. I started reading Trust, but haven't finished it. So I haven't heard any spoilers. So thank you for that. But I was thinking. Yeah, but I was thinking of another historical novel I read that came out like 10 or 15 years ago called Stones Fall, which I think is really good. And it Stones Fall by Ian Pears. And it basically starts in around like 1940, and then there's one section that's set around like 1914, and then the one after that is 25 years earlier, and the last section is set in like the 1860s. And it's only by reading the last section that you kind of understand what happened even though it's earliest, like what happened at the start of the book. And I think historians, we sort of have this idea that, you can't really do that same kind of digression in some ways, or, when Louise, I think, was talking about like kind of writing double narratives, I think that part of the contract we sort of assume we're entering to with readers is that we're not going to kind of try and play around with these things and kind of, drop this thing from like the 1830s in, and then, something from the 1900s and move around, because otherwise, that's just not how, an academically trained writer is supposed to tell a narrative. But that may mean that we're kind of missing out on some ways of like telling someone, a truthful story, because we're trying to stick to the conventions that we expect the reader to read from us.
I was really struck by a comment, and I'm sorry that I don't remember who made it, but earlier talking about trust and talking about not necessarily believing the final section. And it's so this whole time when you've all been saying fascinating things, I've been thinking to myself, what would that book look like if the four pieces were in a different order? right? And I think that that speaks really well to your point about this novel that I really want to read. You know, that ordering matters, and maybe that's another area where like we can think about being more creative, right? That maybe there are different narrative structures that we don't absolutely have to hew to direct chronology. One takeaway for me, but
yeah, the one sorry, I'm walking. The one thing that gives me pause about it reads almost like a novel comment is I think it has an implicit assertion that the purpose is to entertain rather than educate. Mm-hmm. There's no large theoretical value, and that makes me a little sad, perhaps.
It was just this about playing around with time. I just finished hearing as an audiobook C. Hustvedt's book called Something with Memories, where she uses a diary from the 70s and mixes it all the time with the present and the past. And it's just inspiring again to try to construct your stories in another way.
And I was just thinking that we could ask for recommendations, and it's probably not the space in which to do it here. But if people want to read it, send us, Marina and I, their suggestions. We could,
sure we could put it on the website.
For either, you know, history that plays with creativity and fiction, or fiction that plays with history, and we can maybe make a reading list. And we don't know what it is yet.
Absolutely.
2 minutes' time.
Yeah, especially, I mean, it's been so gratifying to see how many people share our interest in these topics. So yeah, we would love to continue the conversation. And I know I'll say, when I thought there would be way fewer people in the room, and I had like written down in our notes, like, oh, maybe we'll do an icebreaker where everyone can introduce themselves and tell us their favorite piece of business fiction. So we'd love to hear those suggestions as well.
But otherwise.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been such a generative conversation.